So we have a moment now to welcome our guest of honor to Santa Cruz, DEENA METZGER. We are here because we're gathered to celebrate A Reign of Nightbirds, her new novel. And, she could have easily just come and done a reading by herself, but all of this, all of her life, and particularly her life right now, is about alliances. And so to hear Stan reading about that just now, and how we find our allies, and how we make alliances wherever we might make them. So DEENA was mentioning when we first met, when I first heard of DEENA METZGER, someone handed me an article when I was in graduate school about two women who'd formed a profound friendship. So profound they were young mothers that when they got together trying to write in the middle of their lives, busy lives, they would actually get together to write and then go in separate rooms and write letters to each other. It was DEENA METZGER and Barbara Meyerhoff. Barbara Meyerhoff, the famous filmmaker, documentarian. We lost her 15 years ago, I think. Someone handed me this article in the early 1980s and said, these two people, these two women, they seem to have a friendship that's like the friendship that I see that you have with someone who's you're friends with. And I read this article about these two women and I knew I wasn't in a friendship like that, not yet, but that I had it in me. And that was the beginning of DEENA showing me a path, a way. And I have followed that ever since. It's not so much that I followed what DEENA did, but I followed what I saw was her unending and fierce commitment to a way of making relationships with others and following those where they went. And making a relationship with the creative and following that where it went. And making a relationship with the spirit and following that wherever it takes her. And so our relationship has been one of my sense now, I can't imagine my life without DEENA METZGER. And there are many people on the planet who feel that way. And it's not that she has been a mentor and a teacher, which she has, and anyone who's been gifted with something like that, you just get on your knees, you're so grateful. Because you don't get that every lifetime. But I got it this lifetime. But it has been really her example, as much as our friendship and our beloved love of each other, that has really guided me for so long. And so I hear about this article and I see this possibility, and then my friend Joyce takes me to Sisterhood Bookstore in the West LA. I'm going to school at UCLA, and I see a poster in the bookstore, right? Everyone know the poster? Yeah. It's DEENA METZGER, and she has been photographed after having had a mastectomy. And there is a tattoo along the scar of her mastectomy. And Hella Hammond, do I have that name? Hammond. Wonderful photographer, has taken a photograph of her standing out in the, back against the sky of her from the waist up nude. And there's this beautiful tattoo with a branch and a bird, and you look at that, and I've shown it to people who've never seen it before, and I've had people look at me and say, this makes me proud to be a woman. That's an iconic poster. It will outlive DEENA forever. It's been around the world many times. It's been reproduced many times. So I see this poster. I've never met her, but already I'm dazzled. So I go to a reading, and I hear her at the Women's Building in LA, the LA Women's Building. And many people read wonderfully, and she gets up and reads this crazy, wild poetry like nothing I'd ever heard. And I just make a beeline across the room afterwards, and I say, how do I study with you? And she says, there's a 6 months waiting list, but I'll take your name. But they called me in 6 months, and here we are. So I want to tell you that the path that she's followed has brought her many places. Because she was one of the first women to write so publicly about having breast cancer and doing that poster, she's been involved with the question of healing and the question of how we relate to the medical system for a very long time. And now she works in an ongoing way with doctors and psychotherapists and healers about how to navigate that system. And at the same time of all of the writing, teaching she's been doing and all the spiritual teaching she's been doing, she has never stopped writing. So DEENA is the author of many novels. Most recently, La Negra y Blanca, which won the 2012 Oakland Pen Award. She's the author of Feral, the book Doors, a fiction for jazz horn, The Other Hand, What DEENA Thought, and several other novels. Her wonderful collection of poems, I think, is back here. Ruin and Beauty, New and Collected Poems, is a lovely connection and retrospective, which includes work from A Sabbath Among the Ruins and Looking for the Faces of God. She wrote a classic book on writing called Writing for Your Life, a guide and companion to the inner worlds. It can keep someone writing for 5 or 6 years. I use it for many, many years. It's a beautiful book. So part of the example, and the life force that she has shown me all these years is how to be fiercely devoted to your creative muse. And there are a lot of creative people in this room right now. And it's thrilling and wonderful and hard, and it makes you want to tear your hair out. And sometimes you just don't know how you will ever keep doing it. And to know someone who's so devoted and has been so devoted for so long is a great gift that she gives so many of us. So I am thrilled and humbled to welcome my beloved DEENA METZGER.
I want to start with what I wrote for the people who endorsed this book. The world is moving into a shadow of great darkness. Despite these tragic circumstances, there is the light of the undeniable presence of the elementals, the spirits, and the hearts of all those connected to the planet. We are called to so much more than protest. We are called to fundamentally change our thinking, systems, and lives, to divest from all forms and activities that lead to genocide and the ravages of pollution and climate change for humans and non-humans alike. The devastation we call climate change and the barbaric ruins of the Anthropocene began in North America in 1492 with the brutal conquest and colonization. Paradoxically, the Lakota prayer, Metakir Yasnu, provides all of us with the essential guidance needed to transform and sustain life. Join us and enter the conversation. So, this book was given. I was coming back from a reading of A Reign of Nightbirds in February 2011. And I was really hungry for the next novel. If I don't have a novel that I'm working on, I'm a really crazy woman. And you finish a book and there's been this long, long relationship with these characters because it takes that long. It's more than 9 months for characters to really come to life. But they do come to life, and then there they are, and now you sort of not really saying goodbye to them, but like grown children, you're asking them to go out in the world and live their own lives. And then there you are, and you've got an empty nest. And so I was leading the reading. I was driving through Joshua Tree National Park. It's cold, it's winter, and I stopped to take a walk. Walking in Joshua Tree, I found myself preoccupied by picking up garbage until my pockets and hands were full. And yet there was no end to it. I'm sorry. The words surprised me. I had said them aloud. "I'm sorry," I repeated. That's when I heard the voice. "You know," the voice said, "her name is Sandra Birdswell, and she is a meteorologist." The voice spoke with authority. I couldn't dismiss it. Authority and insistence. I had been longing for a novel, and now it was being given to me, so I could not refuse, even though I knew nothing about the character. I had no choice but to accept the challenge that would take me far beyond myself. I did not understand where I was being led, but I had to commit myself and write what was called for. At the moment of this book's inception in Joshua Tree, Terence Green didn't exist either. Then a year later, he came to be. To me, as the writer, Terence Green is a greater mystery than Sandra Birdswell, who introduced him. Once manifest, Sandra determined the story that's being told, and Terence, she revealed, was at the core. At that first moment in Joshua Tree, I didn't know anything about Sandra, except her name and her profession. But what followed from that? Entirely unknown and completely mystifying. I knew less about Terence Green. The process of writing a novel seems simple, but it isn't. Write a character into a story, press save. He or she exists. Highlight his or her name in the surrounding paragraph, press the scissor icon on the toolbar, one or another or both die. Then press save to assure their demise. Theoretically, Terence Green can be entirely disappeared from the text. I could paste the words that describe him into a file labeled outtakes, and he would only exist in limbo, waiting to know if he will ever have a real life. That possibility is only theoretical. Sandra appeared, and then Terence appeared. I had great trepidation about writing about him. I didn't know if I have the right to write about a Native man, inasmuch as cultural appropriation is an ongoing violation. But I didn't have the right to refuse him either. Finally, I had to accept what negative consequences might come to me for my limitations and hope to have the skill to record his true self, to honor and respect him as is his due. I had to yield to him. He wanted to live. Sandra insisted, and then he insisted. He asserted that the text cannot exist without him. He carries wisdom. When Terence came forth, Hastine Seda began to speak more forthrightly. He is an elder and certainly a wisdom keeper. The time for this wisdom has come. They will not be erased. It was very early, long before dawn, when light awakened Sandra Birdswell. The broken cloud cover was shimmering with a red glow. It reminded her of the full moon turning red a year and a half before, on August 12, 2003, when proximate to Mars at its perigee to Earth. The radiance was unnerving, as the moon had been then, a blood tide. She propped herself up on pillows and stared out the window, almost eye to eye with the clouds themselves. She waited, listened. Could this shimmer be caused by red waves similar to those she had seen several times in her life as they rose from the imminently vibrating earth before extended earthquakes? But no, everything on the land seemed unmoving. The red persisted. She sensed that deep in space, a flare from the body of the sun was rising up, perhaps already streaming out through the sun's surface towards Earth across the 93 million miles that is the exact distance that makes life possible. She was sure that she wasn't seeing an aurora borealis. Glimmering clouds, perhaps the entire night sky, luminous waves of color, sensation, and light had awakened her, were coming in as if beneath the radar. The physical effect of the flare had evoked an analogous attunement to global events that concerned her, a visceral experience of the twist of tornadoes, thunderstorms, cyclones, hurricanes, spinning across land and oceans. A familiar vertigo seized her, not from the motion, but from the alteration of beauty and distress, her gut knowing. She had sensed this since childhood, but lately the sensations were accompanied with grim understanding. These were no mere natural events. The Anthropocene, she thought. We are responsible. I'm reading a kind of collage of one of the themes in the book. Sandra's mother died in childbirth. Her father was a physician, really wonderful country doc. He was there and he lifted the baby out of the mother, put the baby on his chest as the mother died. Before she was born, before he met her mother, he decided could not go to Vietnam, and so he was in the Indian Health Service and for 2 years, and there he met Hastine Seda, who was a medicine person, a healer. And so Sandra was raised by these two men, really, by her father and by her uncle, Hastine. Visiting Hastine over the years, Sandra had been able to observe him and his friends engage doctoring, an entirely different approach to health and healing than the medical way. Her father's office and the Hogan were her places of learning. She didn't have to choose one over another. Both extended mystery and wonder. But the first time she saw a medicine man extend his hand to scan a patient's body, she felt a shiver of recognition. She wanted to meet the earth the way he approached a man or woman lying on carefully folded blankets on the ground. He moved with quiet attention, deftly tracing every energetic current and flow in the field, both discerning and easing in one gesture with his sure understanding, after years of apprenticeship, training, and prayer, that the restoration of the patient's body and soul could occur just so. His hand moved like weather does, in waves and eddies, restoring the patterns. Sometimes a hand, sometimes a feather. Common sights took on new meanings. Sometimes she saw that the bird passing overhead, its wings stirring the air, was bringing relief to the earth. As the earth cooled for an instant from the inflammation, the fevers, a world on fire. Sandra paid attention. Hastine's example taught her to be aware of assumptions or judgments. Not knowing what something means, not interpreting, became a habit. If her mind was still, it seemed the non-humans could be heard. As with her father, it was easier to respond this way in Hastine's presence, not easy at home. Increasingly more difficult the older she became, the more tense and focused on her studies. But during the crucial years before university, it became second nature to live the analogy between healing mammalian bodies, humans and non-humans, and healing the earth, that body. A murmuration of starlings, the soughing of crow's wings might bring relief. Why not? She did not know about shape-shifting, but longed to become one of those birds. So she's always asked, do you want to be a doctor like your father? And she says, no, I want to be a physician to the earth. And so she goes to graduate school. She starts out, as the voice said originally, in meteorology, but times change. And so by the time she's going through graduate school, she realizes she has to go and study climatology, the larger global sense of what we're in, rather than the daily weather. And Terence Green, who is, as we said, mixed blood, is the chair of the department. The Holy Wind. With these words, Terence Green, chair of the Department of Climatology, opened his introductory lecture. We have come here to study wind. Remember, however, that wind is always invisible and ungraspable. Holy wind, say the original people of this land, in your way you will forget this again and again. Wind is ungraspable in all meanings of the word. You will think you see it, think you have it pinned, but you won't. Different peoples refer to wind as spirit and breath. The holy wind, the DEENA say. In Hebrew, wind, breath, ruach, spirit. Similar. As atmospheric scientists, as climatologists, you will have to study and understand wind and apply your knowledge and observations to follow its different, most common, and most erratic courses. However, whatever you learn, do not forget that the holy wind is always beyond you. You may see its imprint. You may see evidence of its landing. You may fly into it as a hurricane hunter, spy on it as a tornado chaser. You may think you can measure and predict it, and to accomplish this will be your work. But it will always be beyond you. Buddhists say the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. If only scientists would know that numbers are not the thing in itself. To understand that you will never see and never understand wind is the first step to knowledge. Dr. Terence Green turned on a fan and said, because you can make this wind blow, don't think you can control the forces of nature. Know that trying to control them can do great injury. You may be able to turn the fan on and off, but you aren't able to turn the wind on or off. So Terence and Sandra, after the right amount of time, she writes her dissertation, she goes on into the world. A certain amount of time, like with a therapist, has passed, and then he's allowed to call her, and they meet, and of course they have an instant connection. They begin to live together very fast, 24 hours. Maybe 36. they both have houses which they love. She has a house which is circular. It's up on a hill. She can see in every direction. It has a platform above it so she can see even more. It has a weather station. Perfect. He has a house a long house that he built on his own. They're living in a tent. Because, you know, in terms of real life, a house is such a barrier against the world. And they are climatologists because they love the weather and the elementals. So, in the tent. Terence showed her how to build a fire on a sprinkling of tobacco from the materials on the ground. He taught her the fire song. When the fire was hard to start, she sang it, and sometimes it helped. When he sang, the fire started. It wasn't technology, but the singing that made the difference. She had acquired the song, but it wasn't in her yet. Sandra asked Terence, "Is it good to be naked or clothed before the fire?" He said, "It doesn't matter. Fire sees right through you when it burns away all your impediments. To fire, you are a breath that will bring it to light." They were in a tent, not hibernating, but secluded. It was so quiet, she began to feel the global tremors. More and more, she felt tides and the sun's energy. Sometimes she thought she felt the stretch of the moonrise, its drift across the night sky, and the yoga of setting. The new moon was a ping, like an egg leaving her ovary. She was a stringed instrument. The wind played, the earth vibrated in her. What had been intermittent became frequent. She had never had words for these sensations. She had not understood their meanings. If the earth is alive, she began tentatively. Hastings spoke of the earth in this way. Terence put his hand on the small of her back, gentle, holding her up, listening. Terence's added slightly, almost indiscernible pressure on her back, meeting her exactly, responding to the increase in equally indiscernible tremors, so that his touch continued to be consoling, if imperceptible. Earth's pulse, or the earth's swirl on its axis, or the suction and slide of the magnetic pole shifting, a windstorm, a tornado, a series of multiple sensations, as if she were in weather itself, all of it. He held her, so she let herself sink into the center of it. She was the axis and everything turning around her. But then she was taken by a stab of nausea, followed by dizziness and the fear that the earth was buckling under her. Earthquake, landslide, or tsunami somewhere. These were common enough. Any might be occurring, and so she was perceiving them within her. Or an aerial bombardment, a pipeline exploding, a nuclear plant leaking, drilling, taking out the lifeblood, mining, causing huge abscesses, iridescent pains, knives jabbing in sequence, or the sensation of thorns growing into her flesh, and then fevers taking her, her skin blackening under her soft shirt until she shook with sudden cold. In contact with her, he felt it all as well. His hand burning, then turning to ice. He could not flinch or withdraw. Dread, then woe. Still, as she was willing to experience it all on behalf of the mother, so was he. Alongside the pain, the wonder of the continuity. If the earth is alive, she was going to dare to go further. If Earth is alive, if Earth is our mother, Sandra's thoughts, jagged and breathless as they were, continued. Sandra was in the space between breaths, where everything is and nothing moves. Awe. Suddenly, despite or through the pain, it was clear. Earth was alive, and Earth was the mother. Sandra had a mother. She stood up. She stood up straight to contain the quivering that was overtaking her. She had a mother. The mother was alive. Then came the avalanche of bereavement, devastation. She moaned, her eyes rolled back into her head as she shook and wailed, tearing, stabbing, explosive, burning pain, as all the ways the earth was being violated were enacted inside her. The great weight of knowing without being able to mitigate, to save, to change, overwhelmed her. Almost greater than the agony of knowing, of seeing clearly, was the anguish of being helpless. Two 2007 was a very important year. It was the year of the IPCC report, the International Platform on Climate Change. This international assessment of the reality of climate change is the most important official document of this time. Conservative and compromised as it was, it had been written by contributors from across the globe. It declared climate change as real, the Anthropocene as real. He knew what a courageous step it had been to confirm that the use of fossil fuels is responsible for the dangerous rise of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So when Terence reads this report, it has about 4 sentences in its thousands of pages. And those 4 sentences speak of traditional ecological knowledge, speaks of some indigenous people in Africa who the scientists listened to because they knew something about the climate and how things change and how you meet it. And he's completely undone. And so he takes the report, he realizes that he has to read it on the mountain, on the place where he did ceremony as a child, where his grandfather and his uncle brought him. And now he has to go back to that land, having been in the academic world, and read this report and try to understand what we are in and what he is in. He goes up on the mountain, does ceremony, he prays, and then coming down, he falls. The moment he fell, Terence accepted the blow. He bowed down to receive it. He called it in. He was speaking aloud though he didn't know to whom he was speaking or whether he was speaking, or in a dream of speaking, or in a spirit realm to which he had been transported by what appeared to be injury, but was also something else. He was no longer in time or place. There were 1,000 different ways he had accepted that the spirits are real, although Western mind was a miasma of denial that entered through the cracks and fissures of his being like water seeping through, undermining the original structure of all things. He could focus on his body, the pain in his head and his back and hips from the fall. He had fallen and broken, or he had broken and fallen. He could worry about dying, but it seemed irrelevant. The earth was dying. That was the death he was considering. He was a single particle that would survive in one form or another if the universe survived. But the earth? My mother, he said, as if emerging from a war. He was going back through the white mother line to the origin of the bloodletting that had become an incessant flood. He sought the origin of the hemorrhage of the times. He wanted to bleed his mother out of him. He had stood at the snow line that was turning red. He had to do a scan. He had to know before the bleeding stopped. It wasn't injury, it was knowledge. The bleed was memory. He had to taste it in this form. The bleed from his brain that contained his experiences and his ancestors and their experiences encoded outside of language, but translating now into thought, which is the way he knew things. In sharp contrast, the doctors would inevitably make understanding out of alien figures, chemistries, test results, computations that for them, somewhat, but not for him, no longer, translated into information. Information is not wisdom, he argued in himself. What could blood tell him, and what did blood want him to know? He had to know if he was a hybrid or a battlefield. From the point he had reached on Mount Hood, he couldn't see the Hanford nuclear reservation that had taken his sacred Rattlesnake Mountain Lalik into its maw. Though it was about 150 miles as the crow flies, he could smell Hanford the way his people had been trained to smell the death force as it came west over the mountains from across the eastern sea. Not that awareness had enabled them to successfully resist, overcome, or escape. He had turned the entire continent into a marsh. It smelled of sorrow, broken sorrow, salt sorrow, poison sorrow, radiant sorrow, the way that rivers and oceans smell when all the fish die in them at once. Here he was. If he began to think in English, he would be gone. His injuries would deepen. In the English language, he was mortally wounded and had to get to a hospital quickly. Only Western medicine could save him. But if he forbid himself English, its fears and alarms, and entered an indigenous language, even if he had only shards of it or a child's vocabulary, he would gain another understanding. Here he was in the dynamic interchange, in the unceasing world, the ever-present stillness, which was encompassed in the 10,000 years of his almost, but only almost, extinct language. Here he was in his language of deeper knowing. Enabled by his language, a greater agony was coursing through him, melting him into the hidden fire at the molten core of the mountain and into the air around him. Hanford Nuclear Reservation, that abomination, violating the rivers, the poisoned Columbia River, her veins and arteries pumping plutonium, strontium-90, phosphorus-32, zinc-65, arsenic 76, Neptunium 239, and sodium 24, radionuclides, radiation into the aquifer, the torque of mutation, blood clotting the streams, seeping into the terrain, his body, the earth, the winds, the fire, and the water, a dynamic yet unmoving exchange, interpenetration. The blood that he tasted was not a tear, but a dissolve. Mind succumbed to heart. Before he spun into unconsciousness, he managed to scrape some earth into his mouth. To stanch the bleeding, he explained to himself. It was dank, sweet, and cold. A poultice that eased his grief. He gave his body up to the dark vultures and carrion eaters who would gather should he die in that spot. He heard the unlikely sound of an owl in daylight, and he blessed whatever his future might be. He blessed Sandra and the mountains. I'm sorry, were his last words before the dark entered like a landslide of ice and snow. So I'd like to end with a short poem. A greater silence. Soon there will be a greater silence than there is now. I do not want to be there alone. When the last tree falls, may I be under it. May the last tree take me down.